students, let us continue our journey with Module 29 of Unit 3. And today we are going to discuss about quota and other non-tariff barriers. In the previous module, we have already studied about tariff and how it is used as a trade barrier. Now, a country may impose trade barriers due to various reasons. It can be to protect the domestic industries. It can be to collect revenue, or it may be due to some political and other agendas of the economy. A trade barrier basically are various tools and policies by which free trades may be restricted between two countries and may be done for various outcomes. Now, tariff is a tax on import, and it was one of the most historically used means to restrict trade. However, with advent of time, various other non-tariff barriers were also used for restriction of trade. The few common non-tariff barriers include quota, voluntary export restraints, embargoes, sanctions, etc. In this module, we are going to discuss some of these non-tariff barriers of trade restrictions, focusing especially on quota, voluntary export exchange, etc. Now, what is a non-tariff barrier? A non-tariff barriers are various trade barriers which uses to control trade without use of tariff. Note, due to various international regulations and pressures, countries are required to reduce their dependence on tariff for controlling trade. So, countries started moving more and more towards these non-tariff barriers for controlling trade in their country. This may be mostly for protection of their infant industry or for protecting their domestic consumers from their product. We can see in this diagram, there are two different types of barriers of trade that is followed by the countries. In tariff barrier, there are export tariff, import tariff, and transit tariff. Further, in the non-tariff barrier, there are three main domains. One is the use of quotas, second is use of export subsidies, and third, different other non-tariff barriers which like local content requirement, voluntary exchange, embargoes, sanctions, administrative policies, etc. And we are going to deal with this non-tariff restrictions of trade today. What is a quota? A quota requires a quantitative restrictions on export or import of a commodity. This is a direct restriction on how much of quantity a country can import or export. We start our journey with understanding import quota. Now, import quota can be used to protect domestic industry or say protect domestic agriculture, or may be used to correct the balance of payment problem for a country. An import quota is a very common tool used by countries these days. In the industrially advanced country, quota is mostly used to protect their agriculture industries. And in the developing countries, say like India, import quotas are generally used to increase the import substitutability industries in the country by restricting imports of manufactured goods from advanced countries. And also for the balance of payment reasons, such policies are used. For example, India itself imposes a restriction on import of say vegetable oils like soybean oils, crude sunflower oil. For example, there is a restriction of 2 million metric ton of import from abroad. We will be understanding the impact of quota from this diagram. Suppose dx represents the demand curve of the country and sx represents the supply curve. Suppose the world price is given by px. At price equal to 1, you look, the demand for the country is suppose 70 units, while that supply in the domestic market is just 10 units. So this remaining excess demand of 60 unit was earlier imported by this country. Now suppose the government put a restriction of import quota of 30 units of good X, that is only 30 units can be imported from abroad. If this restriction is imposed on the country, you see the price in the domestic market will move to 2, because only at price equal to 2, JH represents the import quota of 30 and 20 units will be produced in the home. So total demand of 50 will be met using this. Now for some reason, suppose the demand curve shifts to the rightward. Now in this case, the price will shift up to 2.5, because only at price 2.5, the domestic supply will be 25 and rest can be imported. So we can see with the imposition of import quota, the domestic price of the commodity goes up. Suppose we are trying to analyze the impact of this import quota and the government have auctioned this import quota. And if 30 units is been imported and suppose 1 rupee per quota is been charged, so the tariff will create a revenue effect of rupees 30, which is shown by the area of JMNH. Now, this is the impact of the import quota. Instead of tariff, if import quota is used, we have something called a rent seeking. That is, it leads to a magnification of the cost of imposition of quota. In order to enforce quota, the government is required to provide a license, and this license requires some economic cost. This may require some substantial cost for the firm to acquire that quota. Let us consider an example from India itself. During the era of 1950s and 1960s, the steel importing countries were required to have a particular amount of size in order to get the amount of import from the other countries. In order to get more and more import, the companies started making more and more amount of blast furnaces, which may or may not be required for production. This led to wastage of resources for the enterprises. We see how quota can create some cost and wastage of resources in the economy. Now, if you have to compare between tariff and quota, we observe in case of tariff, government was seeking some revenue. However, in case of quota, no such revenue is gained by the government. Rather, the firm which gets the license to import the commodity can now import the commodity at a lesser price and sell at a domestic price at a higher cost, thereby getting some benefit of having the license. Similarly, the government in some cases may assign the power of licensing to the exporting country. In that case, the exporting country seeks benefit of selling the commodity at a higher price. Moving from quota, there are other policies which are used to restrict trade, which are not tariff in nature, and we are going to discuss some of them. The first one is called voluntary export restraint, and it is also known as voluntary restraint agreement or a VRA. Now, what is a VRA? In this case, the exporting country may put some restriction on themselves about amount of good that is to be exported by them to the importing country. So instead of the importing country putting restriction, is the exporting country that puts restriction on its export. Mostly this is done on request of the importing country or some kind of threat from importing country regarding trade related sanctions or other restrictions. One famous example is that of the VRA by Japan on the request of the United States. Now, in case the importing country induces the other country by requesting it to export lesser amount of quantity of imports that they are going to receive, this can be a fixed amount or a predetermined amount of export that is to be done by the exporting country. Now, VRA is just like that of an import quota, but in this case the exporting country is one that benefits by getting to sell at a higher price in the importing country. VRA is always more costly to the importing country because in case of tariff, the country were getting some revenue for the government, but in this case the exporting country is getting the benefit. Now, next one is local content requirement. Local content requirement is used mostly by developing country where they may require the exporter to have some amount of local input being used in either the final product or the exporting product of the commodity. Now, the underlying role of this is that this will also give some amount of benefit for the domestic country. Now, in case of India, the Make in India project especially focuses on the local content requirement. For the exporting countries to India, they required to use a part of Indian content in the production itself. We can see this with the help of an example. Suppose a company is producing a car. Now, they can import a part of the car from abroad, say for 60,000 rupees. They can buy that part of car from, say, domestic country at 1 lakh rupees. Now, suppose there is a local content requirement of 50%. In this case, the producer can have 50% from abroad and 50% from domestic market. Had it imported the entire amount, the cost would have been 60,000. But now 50% of 60,000 is 30,000 and 50% of 1 lakh is 50,000. So we are having a total cost of 80,000 for the production of this part. What we observe here, that the domestic price has gone up in this case. Next, what we can have, that we have observed some companies, instead of buying local content, they are exporting the product from that country to gain the benefit of this condition. For example, USA producing automobiles in Mexico have been found to be exporting from Mexico to USA, even if the price of automobile has been higher in Mexico as compared to USA, just to meet the local content requirement. Next is export subsidies. Export subsidies are provided to the foreign players by the domestic country or to the exporters. Now, it can be in terms of subsidy to the exporter, or it can be less amount of loan charges for the importing country. This has been done through Export-Import Bank, which has been providing loans to the importer at a lesser price. This can be seen by the difference between the interest charged in the commercial market and the interest charged by these banks to the importers. Now we know that international agreement restricts such kind of export subsidies, and hence the countries have been doing it indirectly via these loan benefits. Now, how does this benefit? We will see this in form of a diagram. If we see that dx represent the demand curve and xx represent the supply curve of the country. Now suppose 3.5 is the world price for the commodity. At this price, the country is producing 35 unit of the good and the domestic demand is 10 unit of the good. In this case, the country has an excess supply of 25 unit which has been sold to the other countries. Now suppose the government provides an export subsidy and by 0.5 rupees. Now, this 0.5 rupees of export subsidy will push the price to 4 rupees. At price of 4 rupees, we observe that the domestic supply increases to 40. That means the export increases. However, we observe that the domestic demand has decreased to 10. The consumer loses by the area A prime, B prime. The producers gain by the area A prime, B prime, C prime. Whereas the economy has a deadweight loss of the area D prime. This is in terms of the subsidy payment that the government has to do to the producer. So, we observe, though export subsidy increases the amount of export in the country, it reduces consumer welfare and there is a loss of economic efficiency in the country due to production of the good which may be inefficient. We are going to observe the effect of trade policies through this table. We observed in case of producer surplus increased in case of all the restrictions that were made, be it tariff or non-tariff restrictions. And any restrictions lead to a fall in consumer surplus. Though tariff increased the government revenue, in case of export subsidy, the government has to pay some amount. As a result, there is a fall in government revenue. In import quota, the government is not getting any revenue. Same in the case of voluntary exchange. Now, in the case of overall national welfare, in case of tariff, for a large country it is ambiguous, but it definitely falls for a small country. In case of export subsidy, there is overall fall in national welfare. Similarly, in case of import quota, it is ambiguous for large country, but for a small country it definitely falls. And same for voluntary export restraint. Now, the government in a country may use various technical, administrative and regulatory measures to control trade. This may be in terms of health regulation, labeling restriction, quality restrictions, etc. Now, this have been a common practices by putting safety regulations and packaging regulations. This may be in most cases be done for genuine reasons. However, in some cases, there may be thin-veiled in a way to restrict trade. Over time, much importance have been given to border taxes. What are they? In some country, in the country itself, there may be practices of indirect taxation in such a way that the exporters are given some kind of benefits from indirect taxes, whereas large taxes may be charged indirectly on the importers, thereby increasing the price of the commodity in the domestic market. Next barrier to trade is an example called international cartelling. Cartelling is the case where some producers who are producing and selling some commodity in which there are very limited number of producers come together and form a group in order to increase the price and distort the market. In most countries, it is prohibited to have cartelling. For example, in India itself, the Competition Act of 2002 restricts and prohibits any kind of cartelling among industries. Though in the domestic market, it is easier to control and regulate such kind of things, in international market, this may not be possible. One very infamous example is that of the OPEC, where the oil petroleum exporting countries came together and formed a cartel and quadrupled the price of petrol and other crude oil in few years, thereby putting a strong pressure on the economies across the world. Now, in case where there is not enough substitute, and if cartel becomes successful, they may actually behave like a monopolist in the market trying to exploit. Another example is that of dumping. What is dumping? Dumping is the case where a country exports the commodity at a price lower than the cost of production to the other countries, or may sell the commodity at a price lower than that of in the domestic market. Dumping can be of three types. One, persistent, second predatory, and third sporadic kind of dumping. Now what is a persistent dumping? A persistent dumping is a dumping where a country keeps selling the product lower than its cost of production or than the domestic market into the foreign market for a long period of time. Second, the predatory dumping is one where the country purposely sells the commodity at a lower price in order to gain benefit in the foreign country by reducing competitions and taking the advantage of the market or by eliminating competition in the market. In case of sporadic dumping, here for some reason a particular country may have surplus of the product to sell, so purposely they reduce the price in the international market and sell it. In case of predatory dumping, there can be restrictions imposed by countries to protect their domestic industries. This is known as anti-dumping policies. Now, it may be difficult to determine whether the country is dumping or not. But mind you, the domestic producers will always want this on the ground of, say, harassment thesis. They will prefer to have restrictions on other countries' export on the name of dumping. In case of India itself, there have been a various cases where India has claimed that China is dumping product in Indian market to take advantage of Indian market or to reduce competitiveness of Indian industry. Of late, in the year 2001 itself, India put restriction on various commodities of Chinese in the Indian market on the ground of anti-dumping practices. We talk about some in case of India where India uses these non-tariff barriers. These are as follows. India puts custom surcharges, certification requirements, registration requirements for importers, hygienic practice requirement, tolerance limit of contaminations, labeling requirement and packaging requirement. These are the various ways how India tries to restrict import from other countries. Few of the most important sectors where non-tariff barriers have been found is that of textile, food, clothing, vegetables, animal, product, fuel, and hides and skins, etc. So what we observe here, that if in the domestic market there is a monopolist who is playing and getting the benefit of import quota, the monopolist may charge a higher price and thereby exploit the consumers by charging the gap of PQ-PW. In this case, the amount of quantity that he will also sell in the market is Q plus Q bar, where Q bar is the import quota that was provided by the government. And in this case, there will be an exploitation of the consumer. Dear students, in this particular module, we came across the role of non-tariff barriers. While tariff has been an important tool of trade restriction and been historically used, with advent of time, these non-tariff barriers have become very important. We observe there are different ways how government can control trade. This can be either to protect their domestic industry or for the infant industry argument where they want to allow time for the industries to grow through the entire gestation period so as to become competitive in the international market. Now, although this helps the country in protecting their industries, there is a side effect of it as well. As we observe, in all of the cases mostly, there is some way or the other the economy lost. Although the producer got the benefit of these restrictions, the consumers were the ones to suffer. In some cases, government received revenue, for in the case of that of tariff, but in rest of the cases, either the government did not receive anything or had to pay from their own side. So what we learn from here is that any kind of restriction to free trade actually reduces the efficient outcome for the economy. And it is especially true if the economy is a small one. That is, by small economy we mean this economy is not able to impact the world prices. However, if the country is trying to use some kind of policies, this may not necessarily be an economic reason. There may be a political reason as well. For example, if we see the war going on between Russia and Ukraine led various kinds of sanctions in economic form from US and other countries. Also, countries in large nature can use this kind of policies like sanctions to control the economic behavior of small countries. We will be learning more such things in upcoming module. Thank you very much.